In this lecture, we shall consider the origins of deconstruction in the theories of Derrida, particularly as they were first presented to America in his famous, or perhaps infamous, lecture, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. Jacques Derrida reads the history of Western metaphysics as a continual search for a logos or originary presence. Indeed, until the modern period, most of the great Western philosophers have been logocentric in their thinking. Now you're asking yourself, what is logocentrism and what is a logos? Let me explain. Logocentrists consider meaning to emanate finally from some logos or originary source that is pure and undefiled. In other words, logocentrists believe there is an origin to everything. And that origin is sort of up there in the heavens, and it's pure, it's eternal, it's unchanging. The archetype example of a logos is Plato's concept of the forms. We're all familiar with that. Plato believed that up in the world of being were the ideas or origin of all of our earthly ideas. So down here we have beauty with a small b, but that beauty is a reflection of beauty with a capital B, the true idea, the essence, the form, the logos of beauty that exists in the heavens. So once again, if you're a logocentrist, you believe there is a sort of divine, eternal origin to all the things that are in our world. Now, other logocentrists believe in the logos, but they give it a different name. So John, of the Gospel of John, calls it the logos, by which he refers to Christ, the incarnate God. St. Augustine speaks of the Trinity, the triune God, as the logocentric origin of everything. Descartes changes it and speaks of the cogito, the I think, therefore I am. That's the logos, the origin of everything. For Locke, it's not even supernatural. It is the natural laws that run the cosmos or the universe. That would be his logos. Hegel has idea with a capital I. Again, they have various different names, but in all of their theories, there is a belief that there is an origin, that it's pure, that it is the source, and also the measure or touchstone against which we can assess everything in our world. Now, sometimes in the work of epistemologists like Kant, this logos becomes internalized and is known as the absolute self or transcendent ego. In other words, Kant says, well, there is a logos, but it's not up there. It's inside of us. My own consciousness, my own ego, that is the logos. That is the source and origin of everything. But whether it's up there or within us, there is still a logos, an origin that is pure and undefiled and is the measure and touchstone of everything. All right. Most logocentric philosophers provide for the expression of this logos through a sensuous incarnation into the physical, material world. The best example of this, of course, is the Christian idea of the incarnation, the belief that the eternal, invisible Father expressed himself in the incarnation when he took on flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But you know, we can use the word incarnation in a more generic, even necessarily a non-religious setting. An incarnation is any time that logos, which is generally invisible, takes on physical, material form so that we can see it and maybe even interact with it. In the case of Christianity, even know it or have a relationship with it. Now, because of this idea, this desire for the logos to become incarnated, most traditional metaphysicians will believe that the final function of philosophy, theology, aesthetics, even linguistics, is to point back to meaning. In other words, disciplines like philosophy are finally a means to the end, a means to achieve some higher end. You've been listening to a series on philosophy, and many of you gravitate towards philosophy because you want to go on a journey that will take you to the logos, that will take you to truth with a capital T and meaning with a capital M. And we believe things like philosophy and theology and aesthetics will take us, will give us a vision of that logos. And so for many philosophers, that is the purpose of their journey. Let me tell you one other aspect of logocentrism that is important. Logocentrism generally expresses itself through binaries. What is a binary? A binary is a set of two related terms in which the first term, which is perceived to be closer to the logos, is privileged over the second term. Indeed, the second term is often seen as a falling away from the first. The best way to explain this to you is to go back to the most famous and most defining of binaries, and that's Plato. And Plato says the binary is the form and the imitation, or the idea and the image. As we've seen before, the first term would be beauty with a capital B that exists in the world of being. The imitation or image would be beauty with a small b that exists in our world. Again, it's not to say that beauty with a small b is unimportant, but the first term, the form, is always privileged over the second. That's how binaries work. Now, there are lots of examples of binaries. Another binary would be logos, which means word or logic. That's always privileged over another Greek word, praxis, which means acts or experiences. Logos over praxis. Speech, traditionally, has been privileged over writing. Speech was considered purer, closer to the logos. God, after all, spoke the world into being. Speech is pure. Writing somehow is a little dirty. When we write it down, we're getting farther away from the truth. Some other binaries would include intellectual, physical, being, becoming, conscious, unconscious, essence, existence, rational, emotional. In all of those cases, that which is closer to perfection, to the eternal, that which is unchanging, is always privileged over that which alters or decays. And so our soul is closer to the logos because it's unchanging and perfect, whereas the body is considered a little bit of a falling away. It's more linked to our physical, material world. Now, so far, I've been describing binaries to you in a vertical fashion, with the first term up and the second term down. But binaries may also be viewed horizontally, with the first term at the center and the second term out at the origin. At the margin. Now, in general, Platonists think vertically, up to down, whereas Aristotelians tend to think horizontally, from center to margin. But in either case, there's a binary with a first term and a second term. Let us come back to Derrida. According to Derrida, all metaphysicians seek the logos, for it promises to give meaning and purpose to all things, to act as a universal center, a transcendental signified that all signifiers can be referred back to. Metaphysicians, Derrida says, are looking for an origin. They want something they can ground their system in. They want either a center, that's the horizontal way, or they want a transcendental signified, that's vertical, but they want a source. Transcendental signified means something that all of our signifiers, all the thing in our world, can point back to. We want an ultimate source, an ultimate origin, and we want something that's fixed and stable that we can use again as a touchstone to measure everything in our world. According to Derrida, behind this search for a center or transcendental signified is a desire for a higher reality, a full presence that is beyond and thus not implicated in the play of structure. In other words, we want to know that we're not alone. We want to know that there's a presence out there, that there's something out there that is pure. You know, we're stuck in a world with death and decay and change. We want to know that there's some constant in the universe, some presence, something that is there and has authority and is an origin. According to Derrida, Western philosophy, since Plato, has simply renamed this presence and shifted this center without ever breaking from its centering impulse. In other words, all we do is keep coming up with new names for the logos, but it's the same thing. We're still doing the same kind of philosophy. In fact, for Derrida, metaphysics means looking for a center to him. Now, Derrida says even the structuralists are the modernist thinkers that lived in the first half of our century, Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, and many others, even those modernists, Derrida says, even they sought a center, a fixed locus or presence. Yes, Derrida says, they have broken from the old metaphysic, but they still use its terminology and its binaries. Sometimes they reverse these binaries, so instead of soul, body, intellectual, physical, conscious, unconscious, they might flip it and say body, soul, physical, intellectual, unconscious, conscious. But you know what? They're still thinking in terms of binaries. They're not doing something new. They're still looking for a center. They're still using a binary, even if they switch it. Indeed, Derrida says the desire for a center is such a strong one that theorists will often posit one even if it doesn't exist. We have to have a center. We can't function without a center, so we'll make it up even if it doesn't exist. All right, given this, what is Derrida's project? What is his role in philosophy? Derrida would deconstruct all such attempts to posit a center or to establish a system of binaries. We call it deconstruction because Derrida wants to deconstruct, literally break down or explode those binaries. I don't want to just shift the center, I want to throw it out. I don't want to reverse the binary, I want to break it, chop it in half. That's why it's called deconstruction. Derrida would break from the binary and he would replace it instead with a full, free play of meaning. He's not going to replace it with a new center. He's going to replace it with play. Everything's up in the air. Everything's arbitrary. There is no center. There's no presence. There's no origin. There's no transcendental signified. Now, in keeping with Derrida's desire never to freeze meaning, Derrida litters his work with verbal puns and grammatical quibbles. Let me warn you right now, if you're thinking about picking up some Derrida, he is going to drive you crazy. He will give you a headache because Derrida refuses to be put in a box. He refuses to let anybody pin him down. And he's always playing with language. And it's, of course, hard to translate his French into English because it's all puns. He's playing, he's quibbling because he wants to make sure that he does not posit any center or any structure in his text. He wants everything in free play, and so his language becomes playful. And again, it can literally give you a headache. Indeed, as a master player of the game, Derrida is careful never to leave himself open to being deconstructed by another, more clever player. And deconstructionists love to deconstruct each other. Derrida's the best of them. Well, he's the first, but he's also the best. You can't catch him off guard. Every time you think you found a center, Derrida goes, whoops, and he slips right out of the net. And again, it is a game. It's a serious game with high consequences, but it is a game. Now, Derrida's theories that I've been laying out to you were first made public in a 1966 lecture entitled Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. He delivered it, I believe, at Johns Hopkins University, again in 1966. And this lecture is generally considered the birthday, at least in America, of deconstruction. Now let me say something. Deconstruction is basically equivalent to post-structuralism and postmodernism. All of those phrases are basically synonymous because Derrida is breaking away from modernism, breaking away from structuralism. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, all basically the same thing. Now, in his lecture, Derrida, ironically, spends more time attacking and deconstructing modern theorists, those structuralists I mentioned a moment ago, than he does the traditional ones. Instead of going for Plato and Kant and all those Hegel, he spends most of his time attacking the generation or two before him. Little anxiety of influence there. It's ironic, but he attacks modernism even more than traditionalism. Now, this has had an impact. Derrida's attack on all theory, whether traditional or modern, has led to a growing suspicion of and a backlash against all theory itself. I believe Derrida has shot himself in the foot. He's so playful that people are starting to become disgusted with the very idea of theory. In fact, a new school has arisen called neo-pragmatism. And neo-pragmatists like Richard Rorty have argued that there is finally no link between a critic's theoretical stance and his actual practice. In other words, the theory entails no practical consequences. For a neo-pragmatist, theories are just words. After all, our theories don't really influence our actions or our beliefs. And so again, Derrida has sort of shot himself in the foot, and people have started to turn against theory. That's a new school. We'll see what happens to Rorty and neo-pragmatism in the coming decade. All right, let's come back to Derrida's lecture. In his lecture, Derrida identifies three thinkers as his forerunners: Nietzsche, Freud, and Martin Heidegger. These are his origins, he says. And by the way, he deconstructs them too, but less so than other people. They escape a little bit more cleanly. But these are his origins. Let's explain how they are the origins of deconstruction. First of all, Nietzsche. Nietzsche did away with such concepts as being and truth, showing them to be arbitrary and in constant play. In other words, Nietzsche was the one who destroyed the idea of absolute truth. He said there is no such thing as truth with a capital T. In fact, there's no such thing as anything with a capital letter. Truth is a man-made product. It's a man-made thing. And Nietzsche broke away from this idea of truth. He said, no, there's no origin, there's no logos. And so Nietzsche, interestingly, is the father of structuralism. He's the father of modernism because he's moving away from supernatural, absolute things. But he's also the father of post-structuralism or deconstruction because Nietzsche said that all of our ideas are in play. They're all arbitrary. There's no one-to-one correspondence between a word and what it means. Nietzsche breaks away from all kind of fixity, and he starts to put everything in play. And that really leads eventually to the play of deconstruction. That's number one. Number two is Freud. If Nietzsche demolished ontology, we might say Freud demolished epistemology. Freud did away with the faith that the subjective self or consciousness can function as a logocentric presence or a transcendental signified. Remember I told you that some logocentrists say the logos is not up there, it's inside of me? Freud did away with that. Freud said there's no such thing as a self, as a logocentric presence. We're just the products of these subconscious forces. Freud said no, there is no pure ego, there's no pure cogito, no pure I think that can function as a logos or presence. You see, Freud demystified that nostalgic, romantic turn inward that would seek to posit itself and its ego as a fixed, stable center. Again, Freud says even our own ego cannot serve as a center, an origin, a touchstone, a measure. Everything is free play. Finally, Martin Heidegger did away with the metaphysical concept of being as presence, of an eternal, pre-existent I am. Heidegger's particularly difficult to understand, but Heidegger does away with this idea, this faith, this illusion that there's presence out there, that there's some kind of essence out there, that there is the I am that I am, the name that God tells to Moses. Heidegger says, no, there's no presence. We create presence. In this sense, he is a lot like the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued, remember, that existence precedes essence. Traditionally, people believe that there was this essence or this mold, and out of that essence came our human existence. But Sartre says, like Heidegger, that no, we just exist. We're here. We make our own essence. We create our own presence. So again, these three people pave the ground or prepare the groundwork for Derrida's deconstruction. All right, I've explained to you what deconstruction is. Now let's look at the upshot or ramifications of deconstruction. I would argue that what deconstruction does is basically attack the two foundations of Western metaphysics, and those foundations are Plato and Christianity, or maybe Plato and Augustine. And Derrida basically deconstructs Plato's faith and the Christian faith. Let me show you how he does each. I'm going to spend a little more time on Plato. Derrida, in rejecting logocentrism and its earliest proponent, Plato, has, ironically, reaffirmed the foundational tenets of Plato's nemesis, Gorgias the Sophist. In other words, Derrida seems to reach back and take a hold of the theories of Plato's nemesis. Gorgias proposed 3 propositions. They are, number 1, nothing exists. Number 2, if it exists, it cannot be known. Number 3, if it can be known, it cannot be communicated. And I want to show you how Derrida reaffirms those 3 things and therefore explodes Plato's faith and philosophy. First of all, nothing exists. In place of this proposition, Derrida argues that there exists no pure, undifferentiated presence, no norm, no center, no touchstone against which all other imitations can be measured. Nothing exists, by which he means there's no logos, there's no origin. We've talked about that at some length, so let me move on. What about proposition 2? If it exists, it cannot be known. For this proposition, Derrida asserts our inability to find a clear way back to any originary presence or even any controlling system of logic. In other words, Derrida is saying, even if there is a center, we can't find it. We cannot get back there. So even if it exists, we can't know anything about it. In fact, Derrida expresses this inability to get back to the logos in a word that he coined. And that word is différence. Now in French, that's spelled D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-C-E. Derrida spells it with an A-N-C-E. So I'll call it différence with an A. This word doesn't exist. Derrida made it up, and I would call this a one-word poem. Différence with an A is an untranslatable pun that both plays on the French words for difference and to defer, and also breaks down the binary of speech writing. Let me talk about the second first. Remember I told you traditionally speech is privileged over writing? Well, when Derrida gives us the word différence with an A, you see, différence with an E or différence with an A are pronounced exactly the same in French. So the only way you can tell which is being spoken is by seeing it written down and seeing if there's an E or an A. So that very word is a sort of a game to break down this idea that speech is more pure. But there's something more important. It plays on the word for difference, that's différence with an E, and the word to defer. Let's see this work. First, difference. Let's see how it works. Like the structuralists, the modernists, Derrida privileges difference over sameness. In other words, he believes difference is more important than sameness. But Derrida does not share the structuralist faith in structure. He agrees that everything's different, but he doesn't believe in any kind of structure. He believes, Derrida, that every time we think we have found a center or a structure, it points back to some other center or signified. In other words, meaning for Derrida is perpetually deferred. Let me explain. I have a signifier, a word, and I want to trace it back to a signified, some kind of idea or concept. But you know what happens when I find that signified? I discover that that signified is actually another signifier pointing somewhere else. So I follow it out to another signified. Lo and behold, that too is a signifier pointing somewhere else. What happens finally is we can never get to the center or meaning of any text, of any philosophy. We end up trapped in an aporia. Aporia is the Greek word for waylessness. In other words, we get lost. We get caught in an aporia, and when we're in an aporia, we are in a state of suspension in which meaning is always already deferred. We think we're going to find it, and it escapes us. Aporia. Let me give you an example. In every major city in this country, they are working on the highway system. And they're closing up a lane to fix it. And you're driving along in traffic and saying, when is this traffic going to end? And you think, when they finish that lane, I'm going to just zip right to work. But what happens as soon as they finish fixing the lane? They start another one. It's perpetually deferred. You're stuck in an aporia. You're never going to get to work quickly. There's always going to be another lane. Meaning is perpetually deferred. Finally, proposition 3. If it can be known, it cannot be communicated. That finds its echo in Derrida's insistence that there has been a breakdown between the signifier, or the word, and the signified, the meaning that that word purports to point back to. In other words, our words are arbitrary. There is no link between signifier and signified. We cannot come up with one set meaning for a poem or a text or a philosophical tract. Even if we can know it, we can't communicate it because our language is too slippery. Just like Derrida is slippery. Language cannot contain meaning. So, Gorgias all over again. Quickly, let me show you how this is an attack on Christianity. Now, this is not an attack on Christian morality, perhaps, but it is an attack on Christian metaphysics. It is an attack on the centerpiece of Christianity, which is the Incarnation and the Trinity. First, let's look at the Incarnation. Deconstruction marks the polar opposite of the Christian notion that in Jesus of Nazareth, perfect manhood and godhood combined. Or, to put it metaphysically, that God is wholly transcendent and wholly immanent. In other words, the idea of the Incarnation says that God is transcendent. He is the Logos, the transcendental signified. But at one point in history, He came into our world and became a man, and the Logos became known. It became embodied or incarnated. Derrida breaks down that faith in any kind of incarnation. Particularly the Christian incarnation is impossible, but any incarnation is possible. So it's a breakdown of that old metaphysical faith. It's also a breakdown of the Trinity. Think about it. The Trinity is the best way to answer Gorgias' three propositions. Nothing exists? Well, God the Father is the eternal creator and origin, the Alpha and Omega. Yes, something exists, God. If it exists, it cannot be known. What does it say? In Christ, the second person of the Trinity, God made Himself known to the world. Number three, if it can be known, it cannot be communicated. What about the third member? The belief is that God communicates to us through the Holy Spirit via the Bible. And so the Trinity is another refutation of Gorgias' three propositions. So I would argue again that deconstruction breaks with not only Plato, but with Christianity. Now, you know, I'll be a little funny here. We might say that the reason it has taken almost 2,500 years for Gorgias' three propositions to resurface and seize the academy is that the systems of Plato and Christianity have been remarkably strong and resilient. After all, they are the foundation of Western culture. Indeed, we might say that Plato and Augustine trounced poor old Gorgias so severely that it took him a couple of millennia to recover. Christianity and Platonism are so strong that they just beat old Gorgias into submission, and his ideas wait 2,500 years to be resurrected in Derrida and his theory of deconstruction. However, in my ending, I want to be a little more fair to Derrida. I've been a little hard on him, perhaps. And so I want to end my lecture by looking at it from Derrida's point of view. Let me explain. To somebody like me, who is a Platonist and a Christian, if Derrida is right, I might as well go out and hang myself. I mean, to me, the idea of aporia is like being caught in Dante's dark wood of error. What's the point if Derrida is right? But for Derrida, that's not how he feels. Aporia is not negative to Derrida. You see, for Derrida, aporia is not a negative state that should call for a nostalgic longing for meaning and presence, as it does in Rousseau. Rousseau wanted to break away, but he always longed for that presence, for the Garden of Eden, for the pastoral, for the authentic. That's not what aporia is to Derrida. It's not some negative longing for a lost paradise. Rather, for Derrida, aporia is positive. It marks, as in Nietzsche, the joyous affirmation of the play of the world and of the innocence of becoming. In other words, for Derrida, aporia is good because aporia frees us from being bound by any fixed truths or origins. Deconstruction sets us free, and not only does it set us free metaphysically and philosophically, it sets us free from the guilt we might feel over the absence of meaning. Many of us feel guilty because we can't find meaning. Derrida says, hey, no guilt, it's freedom. Nothing exists, accept it and rejoice in it. In this affirmation of positive aporia, Derrida is much like existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who felt that the absence of a higher plan or purpose in our lives did not render life meaningless, but made our choices even more vital. You see, for Sartre, the existentialist, the fact that there's no fixities, no essence, is good, because it means that we are free. We don't have to fit ourselves to some preordained essence. For Derrida and for Sartre, we are free to make our own world, to create our own essence. And so Derrida would say of himself that deconstruction is a kind of radical freedom.